This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Manisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Jovanni, your host, and thank you for being with us today. As November 2024 unfolds, the world stands at a crossroads. The recent U.S. elections have deepened divisions at home, while conflicts intensified abroad. In Gaza, violence spreads across West Asia, with the ongoing genocide drawing international condemnation. As Israeli military operations expand beyond Gaza into the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and potentially Iran, the risk of a wider regional conflagration grows. This escalation heightens the possibility of direct U.S. military involvement, potentially leading to a conflict. The situation is becoming increasingly volatile, with each new front opened by Israel, raising the stakes for all parties involved. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, Russian forces continue to make significant advances across multiple fronts. The Ukrainian military, facing severe shortages of ammunition and personnel, is struggling to hold its defensive line and maintaining cohesion. In these turbulent times, we're witnessing the erosion of international institutions and norms. The United Nations, long criticized for its ineffectiveness, now appears more impotent than ever as it fails to halt the violence in Gaza. International law, a beacon of hope for global cooperation, is becoming torn to shreds before our eyes as Israel operates with impunity, backed fully by Western powers. This shifting geopolitical landscape reveals the waning influence of traditional Western powers and the emergence of new global dynamics. As we gather in our virtual fortress to examine these pressing issues critically, we are reminded that the choices made now will shape the future for generations to come. Now let's welcome our returning guest to delve deeper into these complex and urgent matters. Matthew Ho is an associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network and a former U.S. Marine Corps officer with nearly 12 years of military experience. He resigned from his State Department position in Afghanistan in 2009 in protest against the war's escalation. Ho served in Iraq as part of a State Department reconstruction team and a Marine Corps company commander. He has worked on war policy at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. His writing can be found in various publications, including The Guardian and USA Today. Ho received several awards from his advocacy, including the Eisenhower Prize for Truth-Telling in 2010. He is also involved with multiple organizations advocating peace and veterans issues. Welcome back to the show, Matt. How are you doing?
Thanks, Jovanni. I appreciate you having me back on.
Let's delve right into the topics I just mentioned, lots to talk about. Let's start with the elections. What happened on November 5? Why did Harris lose? Why did Trump win? And do you think Gaza had anything to do with her losing?
Yeah, I think so. We were just talking about how we saw each other back in D.C. a year ago at some of the protests up there. You mentioned I've written in The Guardian. Actually, I was quoted by The Guardian about a year ago saying this is going to have consequences for the elections. If the Biden campaign chooses to not listen to progressive voters, chooses to ignore Arab and Muslim voters, and chooses to go all in on Israel, with what was looking like a genocide beginning to occur, there are going to be consequences for it. And sure enough, the Harris campaign had polling, because we've all seen this polling, that says that if she had taken a stronger stance against Israel, she had said, I am going to condition military aid to Israel on a ceasefire, or I'm going to put an arms embargo, even better, on Israel, that she would have gained many more votes than she would have lost. And that would have been the difference in several key states, most especially in Michigan. They chose not to do that. So they chose to give up Arab American, Muslim American, progressive American votes in order to stay in the good graces of the Israel lobby. Now, the two other big things that stand out for me about the election is that Harris is a terrible candidate. She was a terrible candidate in 2020. She's a terrible candidate now. She did well in that debate against Trump, and that's about it. If you watched her in almost any other forum, most especially that town hall she had with Anderson Cooper in the last weeks of the election, she was just not a good candidate. There's no other way to say it than that. The other aspect is the economics. And I know this is a focal point of what you all talk about on Fortress on a Hill, how these wars have affected working class and middle class families in the United States, how our militarism affects our society, how we lose out as a people because we're buying weapons rather than building schools and hospitals. The idea that the Democrats, and this was enforced by Harris's poorness as a candidate, were just so smug and so arrogant. And when people came forward and said, we're really hurting, the economy is really bad for us, 60% of us are living paycheck to paycheck, more than 60% are living paycheck to paycheck, the response from the Democrats was, you just don't understand how the economy works. You open up the newspaper, you turn on MSNBC or CNN, and one Democratic Party expert after another saying, no, you just don't really understand. The financial and economic hardships you're having aren't that bad because the economy actually is doing really well. You just don't understand how the economy works. It was supporting a genocide. It was having a terrible candidate and telling people, no, the economy's fine. You're just not smart enough to understand how economics works.
Yeah, and it seemed like this was how Marx framed his line is the first time is a tragedy, second time is a farce. And it seemed like they ran the same campaign that Hillary Clinton ran, which is like photocopy of it. They have the same blueprint.
And the results were the same, right? One of the things I would always talk about in the 2016 campaign was the fact that various studies showed 7 to 10 million 2012 Obama voters either voted for Trump or didn't vote at all in 2016. Where did those people go? It's even more stark following this election where Harris is off by about 12 million votes from what Biden got 4 years ago. Where did those voters go? And you see how poorly she performed in all demographics. I don't think there's one demographic where she did better than Biden did in 2020. She lost across the board everybody. And we can certainly talk about the inherent white nationalism, right, that populates a good deal of Trump, MAGA, the Republican Party. There's no arguing against that. But that is an excuse not to look at the realities for the American people, the economic realities of American people, the choices made by the Democratic Party, the decisions made by this current White House. Case in point, 25 million people have lost their Medicaid coverage under Joe Biden. So when COVID happens and under the Trump administration, there was the CARES Act, if I'm remembering correctly, it essentially opens up or expands Medicaid. And tens of millions of people are able to get on Medicaid. And then in December of 2022, the Biden White House and the Democratic congressional leadership decide to no longer continue that Medicaid expansion and to begin to let the states get people off of their Medicaid rolls. So regardless of if you want to say, no, it's the Republican governors that actually made the decision, or Biden had no choice, or it had to do with this, that, the other thing, or it's Joe Manchin's fault, or whatever excuse you want to use. It doesn't even matter. The reality, tens of millions of people got healthcare coverage under Donald Trump, and 25 million of those people lost it under Joe Biden. We could talk about all kinds of things, the child tax care credit. The Democrats went up and down about that. That's a great thing. They should have done that, and they should have kept it. But in 2022, the Democrats decided not to do the child tax care credit. I was astounded this past year listening to the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign talk about the child tax care credit, because I had to imagine all these families around the U.S. saying, yeah, that was great. And then you took it away from me. The arrogance and the entitlement of not even understanding what they had taken from people, just those two examples, we can go into others, I think was a clear demonstration of the smugness and the contempt and the coldness that Americans felt for this administration, whether it was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, being out of touch, essentially, which was exactly what the autopsy of 2016 found over and over again, that people didn't like Hillary Clinton. They didn't trust her. They felt she was a warmonger. They felt that she was an elitist. They felt that she didn't have any concern for who they were as a people. And so essentially, that's what the Democrats ran again in 2024.
So what do you think Donald Trump brings to the table? Do you think the fears of the American left is American liberal left is hyperbolic? Can he deliver to a constituents, in your opinion?
I don't think it's overblown. Certainly there's just on the right, the way that if Kamala Harris had won, to listen to conservative commentators, like every family would have to transition one of their children to a non-binary status or something like that. Both sides are guilty of being dramatic, exaggerating. But we certainly know what a Trump administration has looked like before. We know its assault on civil liberties will be like. We certainly know that the most vulnerable people in our population will have those vulnerabilities very much exposed. People in the LGBTQ community, people in the migrant community, the poorest, the lowest income among us are going to have trouble worse than they're experiencing now. I do think that the concerns about this next Trump, this incoming Trump administration, are very accurate. But I also know this, that it'll be the same as what you and I went through from 2017 to 2021. All our colleagues, all our comrades, all our friends who were out in the streets in 2017 to 2021 will be there again. If I have anything this past week that I feel, it's a bit of a gratitude for knowing what we're up against now for the next 4 years. Okay, I understand who's going to be in the White House. I understand who's going to populate the agencies and who's going to be in the cabinet. We have an idea then of what we are up against. I'm a bit grateful for that clarity, because at least we're no longer wondering if our strategies are going to have to go up against the Democrats or up against the Republicans, especially who will be on our side going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting you said about civil liberties, because that's one of the talking points that's going around this Harris campaign of people advocating to get out the vote. They were pushing for people to vote to Harris, and that's one of the things brought up civil liberties. But that came in the backdrop of students getting beat down by police, right, when they were protesting over the genocide in Palestine. So it was just so it's mind blowing.
Every time I heard that, and that was a more recent talking point in the last month or so, I feel like that was a talking point later in the campaign about you won't be able to organize against Trump like you could organize against Biden or Harris. And that was my thoughts exactly. Where have people not been paying attention this past year, let alone the censorship that has come down across the board on everyone who has spoken out on behalf of Palestine, whether you're whether people in the media, people in entertainment, people in politics. Look how members of the Democratic Party were treated over this past year for their defense of the Palestinian people, and that somehow we're going to be better able to organize than to try. Now, both are bad. And depending upon where you're coming in, depending upon where you're meeting this, just who you are and what your resources are, or what your identity is, all those types of things. Yes, it might be worse under Trump than under Harris, but by and by, you're just dealing with differences in degrees. This is not apples and oranges. This is censorship. This is oppression of speech. This is degradation of civil liberties. And of course, we have to remember both parties are very much in favor of the surveillance state. This idea that one of the parties was going to be better for our First and Fourth Amendments is just ludicrous, because they've both been equally complicit in the robbery, the vandalizing of our First and Fourth Amendments over the last couple decades.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were a former Green Party candidate, critic of the two party systems. So what's your analysis after this election? Do you see a shift in voter sentiment compared to various elections? And do you see an opening, a window for third party candidacy in the future?
There should be, Jovanni, there should be. And I think this week is very disappointing for those of us who are involved with or interested in independent politics. As bad as things were for the Democratic Party this week, even worse for independent politics. When you have this circumstance where you have two of the most unpopular president candidates of all time, representing parties that have just continued to demonstrate their inability to do things for the people, as well as both parties favoring this ongoing genocide. We can go down the list of all these things. And the fact that independent parties, particularly independent parties that were running as anti-war parties, that couldn't muster more than a 0.5 percentage point each, is really alarming. Jill Stein got about 650,000 votes this cycle. In 2016, she got 1.5 million. Chase Oliver got 550,000 votes this cycle. 2016, Gary Johnson for the Libertarians got 4.5 million. So we just look at the decrease in support for these third parties, particularly juxtaposed against the circumstances. There's no reason why these parties shouldn't have had their best years ever. Running against Trump and Harris, running as anti-war, running in a failing economy, running with climate change, exploding on our doorsteps, wiping out entire communities. When we go up 50,000 Americans dying every year from lack of health care, all these things. This is what happened. They got less than 0.5% each. So I think the third party movement, the independent politics movement, really has to take a step back and say, what the heck is going on? Yeah. What are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to accomplish it? It has to be a complete reset. I agree with what Chris Hedges says, that essentially it needs to be decapitated and resurrected. The idea that the performance was this bad. There are a number of things you can look at. You can look at the amount of money raised. Jill, I think Jill's probably, her number's going to come up about $3 million. That's simply, you're up against billion-dollar campaigns. The fact that you got 0.4% of the vote only raising $3 million might not be that bad. Chase Oliver didn't even raise, I think he was around $500,000. I don't think I don't think he broke $1 million. And for those folks out there who are saying money doesn't matter, we're organized on the streets and et cetera, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work, because if you don't have that political arm, look, my view on this is in the 60s and 70s, which is where everyone wants to look back to and say, hey, it was done then. And it was done then. And you had tremendous success from the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement. And going into the 80s, you had a tremendous nuclear movement that had incredible success, because that's what gave Ronald Reagan the political capital to negotiate with Gorbachev. You had all these great examples and successes of popular movements, of mass mobilizations. The establishment, the elites, the empire recognized it. So they evolved, they changed things. And so in the 80s, you start seeing this change in how campaigns are allowed to be financed. And of course, that gets capped off by Citizens United about 15 years or so ago. So you have the establishment saying, we're going to insulate our politicians with money, so that no matter how good the mobilization effort, no matter how great the organization is, it's not going to have an effect. Right. And you saw that, right? You saw that with the Iraq anti-war protests for 2003, which were the biggest protests in the history of the world. You saw that with Occupy, where you had people all around the country just behind Occupy, and they had that tremendous slogan for the 99%. People were behind it. And then, of course, most recently, where you had the post after George Floyd's murder and the protests, the rallies, the marches, the vigils, 20 to 25 million people out on the streets. And what became of it? What political, right? Independent politics, if the purpose is going to be the arm that all those folks out there are killing themselves in terms of organizing and doing an incredible job organizing, right? You look at that from 4 years ago, how successful that organization was, that mobilization was. Look at this past year, how successful the rallies, the marches, the vigils in support of Palestine have been. Largest anti-war march, 2003. And then what was the result? What was able to be accomplished politically because of it? And so I think this has to be a very important moment for those in independent politics because the other thing too is these movements can't rely upon the Democratic Party. We've seen over and over again, there has to be something for them. How do we create a political movement that can actually do for these movements what they're doing? If you look at how successful these movements are and then you look at the independent politics, it's embarrassing. These folks kill themselves and they get all these people out there. And then what happens? What does that turn into? And so after this performance by the third parties, there has to be some real tough conversations. There has to be a lot of new people coming in, a lot of realistic perspective. I talked about the money briefly. You'll hear so often about how the money doesn't matter. But guess what? The money matters when it matters. So those are the types of things where these mantras about grassroots, we don't take money, terrific. I talk to independent candidates about it all this time, and they're going to do this, they're going to do that. And it's okay, great. How many people do you have in your district? How many voters in your district? 550, 600,000 if you're running for Congress. How are you going to get out to them? How are you going to get in front of them? That's the whole thing. We know this because the advertisers and the marketers have done all this research for us. We've all seen those charts where this is the number of times you have to have your name mentioned or your brand mentioned in order for people to not only recognize you, but remember you. Okay, you've got 600,000 people that you've got to get Matt Ho to remember his name, let alone identify with what he's talking about. So if you don't have the money to do that, how are you going to do that? I ran 2 years ago and I learned this firsthand. Certainly, you can go out to all the festivals and state fairs and everything else. And you can shake hands with a couple hundred people every Saturday. It's not going to get you anywhere, particularly if you're running a state like I was and had to get across the 7.5 million people. That's why I didn't break 1% in my race. I was running as an independent candidate, a Green Party candidate in the statewide race. Of course, I wasn't going to break 1%. No one knew who the hell it was. The first time they saw my name was when they saw the ballot. No one's voting for you then.
In the same token, the people who are giving the money, they're giving the money to safeguard their interests. Right. Usually the interest is counter to the interest.
That's exactly right. And so because money has been so hard and people don't like talking about money, and money is our big juxtaposition on our side, particularly on the left, We're not about money. It's almost like a taboo subject, right? It's something that people don't want to get around and talk around, but you have to. I have people who have maxed out their donations. I see people max out donations to independent and third-party candidates all the time. Give $6,600 or whatever the max is now, $3,300 for the primary cycle, $3,300 for the general election. No problem, because they've got it. And they want to support somebody who is advancing these types of interests, who have these policies in mind, who are saying these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. You have just a reluctance from the parties to be too involved with money. It's unseemly. It's dirty. It's not who we are. It's also hard. It's a hard thing to do to raise money. And you have to be dedicated, and you need professionals to do it. And that's not what the third party movement has been about. And this is how we can have these results where Americans are, where you look at the numbers, the polls, 65% of Americans want a third party option. And you look at how well a year ago RFK Jr. was doing as an independent candidate, how well he did for a while. He was getting close to 20%. And then I think he had his own issues and some other things that brought that down. But certainly the desire is there, the need is there, the want is there. It's just a question of whether or not we can deliver it in a manner that actually is going to make a difference electorally and politically.
Absolutely. Let's shift gear. We're coming up in time shortly. Let's talk about Israel, Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu. As a former State Department official and military veteran, how do you assess the Biden administration's handling of the Israeli-Palestine war so far?
I'm not going to assess it the way that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. I would encourage people to look at Spencer Ackerman's column on this. If you don't read Spencer Ackerman, I can't recommend anyone better to read. He's terrific. Spencer reported from a transcript of a press briefing that Lloyd Austin gave. When asked to comment on how he thought the last year had gone, he thought that Secretary of Defense Austin thought that the Biden administration had handled the situation in the Middle East. It's just right. It's so far gone. It's so beyond just is he intentionally trying to mock us? Do these people actually believe this? It's been disastrous. It's been absolutely disastrous. We've armed and we've funded a genocide. We have destroyed millions of lives. Every life in the Gaza Strip has been ruined. The death toll, we don't even know. We may never know. It's going to be years from now. You're going to look this up on the Wikipedia page, and it's going to give you one of those range estimates. We'll never know. But it'll be in the hundreds of thousands of dead. We still don't know what's going to be the outcome of Israel's genocide. I think there are two poles here. One is either military occupation of Gaza or the outright ethnic cleansing and settlement. And somewhere in between those poles are what's going to happen. I think that's what we're seeing. As they're ethnically cleansing the north, you'll probably see sections of the Gaza Strip ethnically cleansed, the Palestinians pushed into essentially concentration camps. Okay. And that's the way it's going to go forward. And the Palestinians are just going to suffer. And that's just one example of this disaster. Certainly the region is close to all-out war, which doesn't take too much imagination to understand where that can lead to. You know, how that could become a world war. The idea, too, is that the United States is isolating itself. This idea of the American empire in decline, I don't think anyone's arguing with that. And I don't think anyone's really arguing or should be arguing that the decisions made by the United States, particularly in the last 20 years, have hastened that decline. Right. And decisions this past year have just accelerated that decline because we are isolated, we, the United States, are isolated in a manner that I've never seen in my life before. The only thing that we can hold on to as an example, our prowess, our imperial presence, is the fact that we have these vassal states that are increasingly tied to us just out of transactional matters. These governments themselves are neo-colonial, neo-imperialist. Look at the Dutch. You look at the Dutch, you look at the Danes, you look at whoever, they want to just matter. They want to be a part of the imperial club. Right, and that's how a lot of their politicians are. Meanwhile, their people are about, we look at some of these European countries, what doesn't matter, it's Western, Central, Eastern, folks are getting the torches and the pitchforks ready because they're so unhappy with their governments. I think that it's been incredible how disastrous this policy has been.
In the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. military attempted to use a COIN strategy, the counterinsurgency operations strategy, right? And the focus of COIN is primarily to protecting and gaining support from the local population, setting up a government, supporting government, that particular government that's been set up, and instead of just targeting solely the insurgents, right? This is for recognizing when you have an insurgency, right? The insurgency getting strength from the population. by isolating the insurgents from the population. The theory of coin is that you defeat the insurgents. But Israel doesn't seem to care about this. Not at all. They control the Palestinian population for the last 70 years, and they don't care. Their approach is just collective punishment, scorched earth to establish their so-called deterrence. They just don't care. What was your opinion of that?
Yeah, exactly. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves or overcomplicate it, right? Their goals really are subjugation. Subjugation, again, between those two pillars of either military occupation and controlling the population or completely eliminating them. Those are the goals that they have. I feel like I haven't seen too much reference to counterinsurgency. God help me, and I don't want to ruin your afternoon either, but I saw a thing with David Petraeus the other day where he was criticizing the Israelis for not doing the counterinsurgency fundamentals that he had put into place in Iraq, all that garbage he was spewing. We haven't seen too much mention of that because they aren't interested in the Palestinian people. They're interested in continuing the colonization of the land that began more than 100 years ago. And it became the goal of the Israeli state following the 1940s. They say it out loud, the Israelis. Naftali Bennett has said it the best, the former prime minister, that this is the best opportunity we've had in 50 years. This idea that here's our chance to accomplish what we've been trying to accomplish in terms of the greater Israel project, in terms of the Zionist program, taking the land that belongs to us, depending upon the Israeli or the Zionist you talk to. Some relate it back to 3,000 years ago. Others are related back to the United Nations in 1947 or 1948. But this idea that the land belongs to them and they need to remove these people is the prevailing view of the Israeli government, of Israeli society. And so the idea of practicing counterinsurgency because you want the Palestinians to accept your authority, to accept a government beholden to you, the Israelis, is not anything they even care about because that's not what they're trying to do. That's not what they're trying to accomplish. You can see it if you go to the West Bank, there's not the counterinsurgency type work being done, right? Counterinsurgency, you're supposed to win the hearts and minds of the people, and you're supposed to provide the people with a reason to choose your government over the insurgency, which is just laughable, right? The idea that people are going to accept occupation because you built them roads and bridges and the well or whatever. It's really stupid. There's not a better way to describe it than that. It's ahistorical. It goes against who we are as humans. When you're in the West Bank, you don't see counterinsurgency programs like winning the hearts and minds. The Israelis are systematically and deliberately debasing the Palestinians every way they can, whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's their culture, whether it's whatever they can do to try and force the Palestinians to leave, try and make everything as uninhabitable. So yeah, the Israelis have never had that approach. If they do say anything about it, I'm sure it's just because they're being annoyed by someone like General Petraeus and they just want to humor him and get him to leave.
So Matt, many call this a live stream genocide, right?
Yeah.
Happening right in front of our eyes. Like I mentioned earlier, the UN has made a mockery. It's showing it's impotent. They can't do anything about it. International law is just being shredded in front of everybody's eyes because the West is so bent on supporting Israel. Do you foresee Israel in the near future or in Israel go the way that French Algeria went or Rhodesia went or apartheid South Africa? Do you foresee that in this Israeli apartheid state?
I think, say, French Algeria, there's no place for the Israelis to evacuate to, right? There's no place for them to leave and go to. With the South African model, I think the Israelis learned a lot from the South African experience. I certainly see, I think two things occur in the 80s that really shaped what we've seen in the last decades with Israel and its relationship to the U.S. One is the American response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where President Reagan is upset. Everyone has seen on Twitter and in social media various types of history lessons being presented about how Reagan handled the prime minister of Israel, Begin, at the time, and how he told him to shut it down, and the Israelis did. The way the American media handled that invasion and the way the American media talked about it very frankly and candidly and honestly, and were very critical of the Israelis. And the Israelis understood that at the same time, the South Africans had at that point lost potentially the whole world, with the exception of Israel and the United States. What turns it is that political support in the United States is so against South Africa and the U.S. support for South Africa that the Reagan administration has to buckle, right? So the Israelis look at these two things and they come up with their modern political and media operations, whether it's the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, or what's known as Hezbollah, the information operations, where they're going to do everything they can to control American politics and to control American media. The media is being undone, of course, by the technology we have, by the rise of independent media, by the fact that genocide is being live streamed. If this genocide was happening 10 years ago, we would not be able to see it the way we can. It's only because everyone has these phones that we're able to see it, right? So Israel would have gotten away with it in a way that they 10 years ago would have gotten away with this in a better way for them, so to speak, than they can now because everyone can see what's happening. But politically, they still have that strength. And AIPAC, of course, is crowing about how well they did in this election, how much money they spent, people they made examples of. This idea with Israel is that Israel becomes so isolated along that model of South Africa, where the entire world is against them. They're being sanctioned. I don't think even that's going to happen because a lot of these nations are hypocritical. Like South Africa, which leads the genocide case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. South Africans are the biggest suppliers of coal to Israel. So there's still that hypocrisy, and that's got a long way to go if sanctions or anything like that were to occur. But say it does. I think the Israeli belief is that they won't lose the United States. They learned from the South Africans in the 80s, and they won't lose the United States the way the South Africans did, because they've done everything they need, particularly politically, to insulate their politicians so that you could have, like we just saw, where for the Harris campaign, the data was all there. The polling was there. The polling numbers were there in the sense that 90% of Democrats favored a ceasefire. 39%, if Harris had imposed an arms embargo on Israel, 39% of respondents said that they would be more likely to vote for her, as opposed to 7% that said they'd be less likely. She was going to get many more votes by going against the Israel lobby, potentially win this election, but she chose not to because the Israel lobby, Israel, is so strong because they did what they had to do, learning from South Africa to protect themselves. So you get to this point where essentially you could have a fortress Israel. And I think that's what the Israelis are okay with. This idea, as long as we have the United States, we can be fortress Israel. And for many of them, that lines up with their understanding of the world. That lines up with their metaphysics. That lines up with their cosmic and religious history. This is the way it's supposed to be. Israel versus everybody. And for the Americans, it makes sense too, because more than half, I don't know how many members of Congress would say things like, the two nations that the good Lord have blessed is Israel and the United States. So that you got this, right? You've got this relationship that the Israelis are banking on. And so I imagine, Jovanni, you can get to a point where Israel resembles Afghanistan. You have this political leadership in Afghanistan that doesn't care about the rest of the world. They're going to do what they want to do. And in the case it's different is that the Israelis, of course, are banking on having the support of the Americans.
Let's move on to Eastern Europe. So you mentioned that Ukraine is inexorable, moving towards a military defeat. What specific indicators lead you to that conclusion?
Oh, I think now, particularly the Donald Trump now, I think that's the big one. And if people saw Volodymyr Zelensky's congratulation message to Donald Trump, which is on Twitter, if people haven't seen it, I'd urge you to go read it. Nowhere in that message does Zelensky talk about victory over Russia. Nowhere in that message is Zelensky defiant. Nowhere in that message is Zelensky talking about the loftier goals of democracy, freedom, liberty, or protecting the West from Russia. It's all about how I see us as having a great partnership going forward. Ukraine can be an integral part of the European community. We can help the United States anchor American security by being present in Europe that the U.S. once was. This was first proposed by Boris Johnson several months ago, the former British Prime Minister. I thought this was absolutely nutso, because usually anything that Boris Johnson says is nuts. But he said something along the lines in this panel discussion about how the Ukrainians can replace the Americans in Europe. And at the time, I just thought this is nonsense. And then Zelensky repeated it a couple of times, and I thought it was nonsense. And then he said it again the other day. And my thoughts were, this ties entirely into Trump's line of thinking, that the United States needs to renegotiate NATO and have the Europeans pay for their own security. And here's Zelensky saying, I will do that. Mr. Trump, I will do that. I will backfill the Americans in Europe. And essentially, through his words, through the absence of what he's saying, I'm open for a peace deal. I'm open for an agreement. And this is what we just saw as reported in the Wall Street Journal coming out of Trump's team, And you got to caveat that with this is Trump, so who knows what's going to happen. But the Trump team is saying that Trump's proposal for Ukraine is going to be an immediate ceasefire, freezing the conflict along the lines that they are now. Russia keeps the land it's occupying, and the front line is demilitarized, so on and so forth. That Ukraine pledges not to try and join NATO for 20 years, and that the Americans continue to sell Ukraine all the weapons that they want. And that's the Trump-Ukraine peace strategy, as far as we can tell via Wall Street Journal. So what Zelensky says the other day fits with that, because he's not going on about victory. The writing's on the wall for the Zelensky government. Certainly, you look at all the indicators, say if Harris had won, the reality is that the Russian army is moving forward a couple kilometers, maybe more every day, that the momentum is fully behind them. The Ukrainian army is certainly on their back feet. The Ukrainian army has been led by we could talk about the Ukrainian army and its bravery and its will to fight and its performance, which I think most people would say is pretty laudatory. But you look at Ukrainian leadership, and certainly the Ukrainian leadership has been catastrophic. The fact now that you have had a Ukrainian army that's been on its back foot for more than a year, essentially, since that disastrous offensive they launched in the summer of 2023. For 16 months now, the Ukrainian army has been falling backwards. And the Ukrainians have not prepared any defenses in depth for which the Ukrainian army can fall back into, right? I think anyone who's got the basics of military tactics and operations would understand that in this circumstance, prepare some very serious defensive lines in the geography and the topography that works well for that, and have your forces fall back to that. The dangers too is that the Ukrainian government is a patronage network, similar to what we saw in Afghanistan. It's incredibly corrupt. The entire Ukrainian economy is sustained by foreign assistance. If that money ever dries up, or even the threat of it dries up, there's going to be a panic, just like we saw in Afghanistan, and that will bring about collapse. It's not even the case that the Russians need to defeat the Ukrainian army on the field. It's the fact that just have to get to the point where the Ukrainians feel like it's over for them, a panic sets in, and then collapse comes. And that can come especially from, say, a Trump administration that says, we're not giving you any more money. Once that panic happens, like a bank run, the consequences would be catastrophic. And the Russians realize this. The Russians understand that a collapsed Ukrainian government means what? Essentially, warlords take over in central and western Ukraine. You have a Syria, you have an Afghanistan, like a failed state that's in the midst of all types of warlords.
Plus, you have so-called allies like Poland also eyeing a piece of Ukraine for themselves as well.
Exactly. Or the Romanians. You don't need to be a big history buff to know this stuff. This is on the first few paragraphs of the Wikipedia entry. And so what happens there? Collapse, right, Jovanni? And say the Russians are moving westward, which I don't think they will. I don't think they really want to go much farther west than they are now, because they didn't want to have an insurgency, like all that type of stuff. And that was never their goals. But say they do start moving west. What do the Poles and the Romanians do, right? Now you've got two NATO armies trying to take territory in Ukraine, potentially coming into conflict with the Russian army, plus Ukrainian elements that are wandering around. And it's like a warlord dystopia type of thing going on. Yeah, the Russians recognize this, and who would want that on their front yard or side yard or backyard? So I think the reception from the Russians to Trump's proposal, if it is as it is, will be agreeable. Results may not look the same as what Trump people expect. It's definitely going to go in Russia's favor. But I think the Russians want to end this sooner than later. And all the talk about how Russia is winning and they're going to, et cetera, and it's true. But they're also wise and mature in a manner that people like you and I, after experiencing our leadership over the last 20 years, have a hard time recognizing.
Matt, our 45 minutes are up. Do you have an extra 10 minutes?
Yeah, we can go 10 minutes.
All right. So in your opinion, with what you just summarized now about Ukraine, if a defeat of Ukraine, will that be a defeat of NATO in your opinion?
No, actually, I think the opposite, Jovanni. I think it will be the storyline, the narrative, the reason for NATO. You go back several years ago, and there were honest and sincere conversations about what's NATO's purpose. The conversation should have been had in 1991. Should have happened in December 91. As soon as the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin, that conversation should have been had, rather than it quickly became about expanding NATO. Now we're in this situation we're in. I think what happens is that an occupied Eastern Europe, an occupied Eastern Ukraine gives NATO its Jerusalem, right? Our purpose is to retake the Donbass. It becomes a driving narrative. We have to stay strong, buy more F-35s, because look, what do you forget? The Russians are occupying Ukraine. The Russians launched this war a few years ago, and then they occupy on and on. And there is all kinds of other narratives about Ukraine could have won if they were just given the equipment they needed. If we had gotten the Ukrainians, the F-16 sooner, essentially we stabbed the Ukrainians in the back, we betrayed them. All those storylines are already being circulated. So I think what it does is it provides the reason for being for NATO going forward. And it's interesting too, because you see other elements of this as well. The new head of NATO, Mark Rutte, who is taken over from Jens Stoltenberg, who was incredibly hawkish. And so the new guy has to be better than the old guy. So how do you be a bigger hawk than the old guy? You expand the presence of your hawkishness. Where Stoltenberg and NATO had begun the last several years really talk about expanding NATO into Asia, I think that's where NATO's also going to look towards. And you saw with these reports of North Korean troops being with the Russians, the South Koreans are really upset about this. And there's stories about the South Koreans now maybe get involved or whatever. But the big thing is that this is a type of storyline that you need to get NATO into Asia. The fact that the North Koreans went to fight in Ukraine, we see that this is just not a European war, that we can't be so foolish or naive to believe that all these things, it's not global, it's not interconnected. So if the North Koreans are going to have a presence in Europe, we have to have a presence in Asia. You've seen through this is not just the reason for NATO's being, but a reason for it expanding into Asia.
Haven't we already been seeing that with favorable nations in South America, with Colombia entering a special NATO partner and all that? Have we been seeing this expansion already?
Yeah, we have. The idea of formalizing it, which I think is really possible. So I think in 10 years' time, seeing Japan or South Korea as a NATO member or Australia as a NATO member, and people will go along with it. Just in our college football, right? None of the teams in the SEC or no one is anywhere geographically located anywhere near they should be for the conference they're in. So people go along with it. As preposterous as they'll be, that's a possibility, is you'll see that expansion of NATO into Asia. Because you're exactly right, Jovanni. It's already there. This relationship with AUKUS, the fact that you have the German and French warships going through the Taiwanese Strait, things like that have already been occurring. So that seems to me is the logical progression of this.
Moving gears before we get out of here, let's talk about BRICS, BRI. Do you feel this initiative of BRICS and BRI and the other one, the Central Europe
cooperation?
Yeah. So do you see these, because we're witnessing a shift in the global balance of power, right? For the last 300 or 400 years, the balance of power has been centered in the West. But now we're seeing a shift. Do you see these organizations that are forming, these blocks that are forming, the likelihood of reducing military conflicts with the fostering of South-to-South economic interdependence?
Yeah. I think it's like when streaming services became available for people in their home and they were able to get rid of cable. People had this relationship with the cable company, entirely extractive, gouging and everything else. Now I'm being glib here, but I think that's what we've seen, particularly with BRICS, this alternative that's available. For the last few decades, since the end of the Cold War, there's been no alternative but the Americans, right? There's been no alternative but the U.S. empire and its hegemony. And now there are alternatives. The behavior of the United States, the decisions made, the policies carried out, the wars conducted, the coups, just all the more reason for people to say, I've got to link up with somebody else. I got to protect myself and my country from the American empire, as well as the transactional nature of it. Everyone knows you're on the losing end of the current world monetary, financial, and economic order. The international legal order doesn't exist because of the United States. And the only reason that's the world economic order is because the United States benefits from it, because the United States wrote it during World War II and put it into action. So the fact that people are on the losing end, particularly nations in the global South, that every year for decades see trillions of dollars be extracted from their economies to the Western economies for no other reason. That's the way it's been for centuries. Now there's an alternative. Now there's something where the playing field may be more level. where at least it's not going to be this, I've got a gun to my head, and if I don't do what the Americans say, they're either going to sanction me, or they're going to coup me, or they're going to invade me and occupy me. Just that very in-your-face base kind of explanation of why this is occurring. It doesn't have to be any harder than that to understand it, right? Of course there's an alternative. Why wouldn't there be an alternative? And the success of it, it continues to grow.
And we're seeing the diplomacy as well. For example, how South America and the leadership of Chavez started the diplomatic de-escalation of the conflict in Colombia between the FARC and the Colombian government. We're seeing how the Havana, for example, in Cuba, they're participating in the de-escalation of the conflict in Colombia. We've seen the ELN and the Colombian government. Recently, we saw the diplomacy brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I just saw today also that Russia is taking part in diplomacy to bring together China and India. All this is being done without the involvement of the West. And we saw how recently in the Sahel in Africa, the countries that pretty much broke off from France, and they're coming together, building their own bloc in the Sahel as well. So we're seeing that.
That was the big storyline coming out of the BRICS conference last month. India and China had brokered an agreement and pulled their troops back from the border. That's something that people in the United States, that's impossible, won't happen. The same Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran just last week or 2 weeks ago held joint naval exercises together. Well, I thought that was impossible. I thought that was like you had the same degree of that happening as walking through a brick wall. Right. I remember looking a number of years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, at the list, the roster of all the different special representatives that the U.S. State Department had. A special representative for all kinds of things, terrorism, for whatever, all kinds of stuff, 50 of them about. And there was no special representative for Kashmir. One of the most, particularly when I was looking at this list 10, 15 years ago, the flashpoint, the tension, the fact that these are countries that have already gone to war 4 times in the last 70 years or whatever the number is, and Kashmir being such the importance of it. And the United States doesn't have a diplomat dedicated to Kashmir. You still have Pakistan and India, but in separate military. The whole thing was crazy. You see the unseriousness of American diplomacy. And then this last year, with the complete destruction of international law by the United States, led by Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN, but also Tony Blinken and others. Whereas international law dying and bleeding out, the United States really has killed it. When you look at places around the world like Singapore, and how come Singapore is so successful, and you talk to people who do business there, is they said because there's a rule of law, because they have a law that's followed. They have courts that we can depend upon. We can headquarter our businesses here and have a predictable outcome. That's the nature of people also moving towards these organizations like BRICS. There is a belief that these organizations, while they won't be perfect, will be fair, that they will follow law and rules and treaties and other things that bind everyone together. Another reason why people feel the need to get away from the American empire.
Now, we've seen the fall of the U.S.-led Western Empire established in 1945.
Have we seen the fall? No, it's still around.
We're witnessing the fall.
Oh, we're witnessing it. I would say to people, be careful. Certainly that's what we want, but we want this thing to come to a soft landing, so to speak. The consequences of it breaking apart traumatically would be catastrophic for the entire world. Certainly things like climate change, de-dollarization, even just watching Trump talk about the tariffs. We're a country that is dependent upon imports. And so when all of a sudden inflation is back up again because we've got a 60% tariff on things from China, the consequences here are going to be felt overseas by the disruption and societal unease of the American people. The other thing I'll say about the empire is that there's that saying, the dying mule kicks hardest. The American empire is not going out without a lot of death and destruction and violence around it. It's not going to go quietly. It's going to go very violently and very aggressively.
Lots to think about. Thank you. This is a good place to wrap it up for today. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you
for coming and talking to us, sharing your experience, your insights. Before we go, what are you working on and where can people plug into your work?
Yeah, so I'm the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network. You can just Google Eisenhower Media Network. I think the easiest way to follow me and my work is to follow me on Twitter, Matthew P. Ho, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H. And then I'm on Substack as well, though I'm not nearly as good about posting on Substack as I should be. If people want to follow me on Substack, it's Matthew Ho at Substack or Matthew.ho at Substack or something like that. I'm pretty sure I'm the only Matthew Ho on Substack, so you can find me that way.
What's that name from, by the way?
It's German. I used to be a whole.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. Thank you for joining us. Like us, subscribe to our channels on YouTube, X, and Telegram. Look us up anywhere you listen to podcasts, and please share with your friends and help us grow. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.